G'day everybody, it's great to have you joining for another demo. In this one we're going to continue on where we left off by creating a virtual machine and deploying that to our existing virtual network. So what I'm actually going to do this time to create our virtual machine is rather than going through the virtual machine option that we see here, I'm going to click on create a resource. Those are two different ways that you can actually create resources. We could browse into the area for the service we're working with, such as resource groups or virtual networks like we did in the previous demonstration. Or you can go ahead and click on the plus to create a resource, and then you can search all of the available services and all of the available products from the Microsoft Marketplace. So we'll see straight away we've got the option here for a virtual machine. Now we could either go ahead and click on create, we could choose any one of the other options here, or we could even search for it by typing in virtual machine and pressing enter. Now if you do choose to go through the create a resource option, just bear in mind it's going to introduce you to the marketplace, which includes a range of other non-Microsoft products that you could get access to. So we could scroll down and you can see there are other products here from Microsoft and other organizations as well. For us, we want to create a virtual machine, a standard Azure service, so just bear in mind that that's what we are choosing. Virtual machine created by Microsoft, it's an Azure service. So I can just go ahead and click that option here, and then we can just go ahead and click on create. Now, however you choose to get to this creation experience, once you get to the virtual machine side of things, it's always going to look the same. So whether you choose to go through search, by clicking on create a resource, or by just browsing through the virtual machine services section, you're always going to get to the same section when you create a new virtual machine. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and fill in all of the different properties that are required by virtual machines. We'll see the same sort of thing that we see for every other service, which is that we need to pick a subscription first. So I'm going to pick my only subscription that I have available. I need to choose a resource group. I could choose an existing one, but I actually want to create a new one by clicking on create new. I'm just going to type in VM1-RG for my resource group and click on OK. I will need to have a name for this resource. Let's choose VM1. And then we can see I have to have a region. Now do remember that the region I choose here is going to be limited if this is a brand new free Azure subscription compared to the list of regions that are typically available. So for me, I'm going to search for Australia, and rather than seeing Australia Central, Australia Southeast, I only see Australia East. So that's the option I'm going to pick. Now, like we spoke of within a previous lesson, you'll see when it comes to the infrastructure that we deploy to in terms of Microsoft's global infrastructure, that's going to depend on the service that we are deploying. With virtual networks, we could just pick the region. With virtual machines, we could actually choose to pin this service to an individual availability zone that exists within Australia East. However, for me, I don't want to deploy this to just one availability zone. What I actually want to do is choose no infrastructure redundancy and just send it to the Australia East region. In the real world, like we spoke of within the lesson, that's actually going to be up to you depending on what sort of redundancy, what sort of high availability you're trying to configure, and depending on where and how your solution will be accessed. So we can leave that as is. I'll scroll down a little bit here. I'm going to leave the security type as standard. Now you could choose to use Linux if that's your preferred operating system. However, for this demonstration, I'm actually going to choose the Windows Server 2022 Data Center image, and you'll see there are lots of other images available here when we go and create virtual machines. So I'll choose that image. And then really importantly, you'll see I have to pick the size. Now this is something that we do want to be careful about to ensure that we're not getting a large bill and burning through all of our credits. So I can click on the See All Sizes option. And really importantly here, you can see some of these services are free service eligible. So for B1S virtual machines, they are free for the first 750 hours, which is approximately a month. I'm going to choose that B1S option to ensure that I'm not getting any surprise costs. I'll go ahead and click on select. Now, if we scroll down a little bit further, you'll see there are some other settings we need to configure. I'm just going to quickly pause the video, enter in a username and password, and I'll be back shortly. Now make sure that if you are following along, you enter in your own username and a password that you can remember, because we can in fact go and connect to this, and that's what we'll do at the end of this demonstration. Now for inbound port rules, I'm currently going to choose none, and we'll configure this in an upcoming section. So I'm going to scroll down and choose next for disks. You'll see just like for virtual networks, we're moving along a range of different properties that we need to configure for the service that we are deploying. Now, if you want to keep costs low, you can also choose to change the operating system disk, and just bear in mind that premium SSD is fast but the most expensive, standard SSD is in the middle, and standard hard disk drives are at the bottom. For me, I'm just going to leave this as premium SSD because I'll delete this at the end of the demo, and I'll go ahead and click on Next for networking. Now for the virtual networking, if we have chosen the region that we created our virtual network in, you should be able to click on the drop-down option and you'll see that virtual network here. But if you haven't created the virtual network like in the previous demo, or if you just want to create it in this step, you can in fact nice and easily do so through this wizard right here. For me, I'm going to choose the virtual network that we created earlier, and I'll use the default subnet that was created by default. And then for us to be able to test if this virtual machine works and actually go ahead and log in, I'll also need a public IP. So this is where we can start to see what we also discussed within the lesson that covered public and private services. So a virtual network itself is private. A virtual machine must be deployed to a virtual network. We don't have to have a public IP if this virtual machine just needs to be private. For example, if we had several other virtual machines that were in there that were talking to each other privately. However, for us to be able to connect to this and actually see that it works, we will need a public IP, so I'll choose that option there. Now, another item we do need to configure to ensure that we can connect to this virtual machine is something called a network security group. And once again, we can actually do this all nice and easily throughout this creation wizard. So what I'm going to choose to do is for the NIC network security group, I will click on the basic option and then go ahead and choose allow selected ports. Now I'll scroll down a little bit here for better visibility. And then I'm going to go and click on the drop down option and just choose RDP. Now, if earlier on you chose the Linux option for your virtual machine image, you would want to choose SSH here to ensure that you can connect remotely via SSH. We chose Windows, and so to remotely manage our Windows machine, we'll use RDP, so just make sure you've got that box ticked there. All we're really doing here is saying, for our virtual machine, what type of network connectivity will be allowed inbound? In other words, from outside of the network into our virtual machine. For us to be able to connect to that and test it, we will need RDP. So what we'll do is we'll scroll down and we'll see that there's no other settings here that we really need to change. So let's go ahead and click Next for management. Now we don't need to change any of these management settings, choose Next for monitoring, and I'm just going to go ahead and disable the boot diagnostics and go ahead, click Next for advanced, leave all of this as is, Next for tags, and then click on Review and Create. So you'll see here whilst we've been creating this virtual machine, it's the same sort of experience that we had when we created our virtual network earlier. And it's going to be the same sort of experience for whatever resource you are creating. Okay, so once that validation has passed successfully, we can go ahead, click on Create, and it's going to start the deployment of our virtual machine to our resource group. All right, everybody, so that's going to take a little bit of time. Now, rather than sitting here and watching this complete, I will pause the video and then we'll come back shortly once this is ready to go. Okay, marvelous. The creation of that virtual machine has completed successfully. So what I want to do is not click on Go to Resource. I'm going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to click on the VM1-RG resource group that we just configured. And what I want to show you is what we talked about in the earlier lesson. And that is we have these various resources here, all within our resource group, all within our subscription. So this is the resource hierarchy that we spoke of. If we wanted to go and configure some sort of security settings, we could do so through access control. We could apply those access settings at the resource group layer, and then they would also all apply to our resources within that resource group. And another Azure feature that is out of the scope of this course is something called policies. That's one of the other very common items that you're going to be using that you can configure at the resource group, resource, subscription, or even management group layer. The access control helps us to configure who has access to what operations for what resources within our subscriptions. The policies helps us to go and enforce standards and compliance within our subscriptions. Another important item to understand here is that we went about configuring a virtual machine, but we ended up with multiple different resources. So do understand that there are some services that require multiple different resources to be deployed to be functional. Our virtual machine requires a network interface card, a network security group, public IP, and a disk for storage. And it's also deployed to that virtual network that we configured earlier. Okay, so that's enough about the theory. Why don't we go ahead now and try and connect to this virtual machine and make sure that everything works as we expect. To do that, I'm going to browse to Virtual Machine 1 here. We'll see we now get the settings for that virtual machine. We could go and change all of these settings, manipulate the network configuration, disk, the size that we configured if we wanted to scale up or down in terms of adding additional resources or decreasing those. And there's lots of other things that we can do here that I cover in my other content. However, for this demonstration, just to wrap things up, what we want to do is go ahead and remotely connect to this. So we can click on the connect option, and you'll see here we can choose RDP, or if this was a Linux machine, we could choose SSH. Now, I personally actually prefer to do this a different way. Rather than using the RDP option, I'm just going to take a copy of the public IP that has been assigned to my virtual machine, VM1, and then I'm going to open up a remote desktop client that I have installed on my computer. So I've taken a copy of that public IP to my clipboard. I'm now going to browse across to my remote desktop client, and you can use whatever client works for you depending on what operating system you are using. I'm going to choose Add PC. I'll paste in the public IP address, and I'll go ahead and type in VM1 for the friendly name. Then we'll click on Add, and I can go ahead, double click this, and connect to my machine. So I'll type in my username and password, and then click on Continue. We'll click on Continue once again, and you can see I'm now remotely connecting to Virtual Machine 1. Okay, so there you have it, everybody. We've successfully created a virtual machine in the virtual network that we deployed earlier. We've got access to that over the internet because we've opened up the network security group to provide us that remote connectivity over RDP. Now, it's really up to you if you want to go ahead and install something on this server. You could do something like configure it as a web server and access it via that public IP, as long as you update your network security group to allow HTTP or HTTPS access, or you could just go ahead and delete this once you're done, like we'll do in the next demo. So everybody, thanks for joining me. I'll see you again on the next demo.